Kicking us off. So good morning. Welcome. I'm Jen Sis, Director here at Stafford Regional Planning Commission. Welcome to our second Resiliency Roundtable conversation, first of which we are doing in person. It was fun and exciting to see folks here at the office again and be able to do this. One of the kind of wonderful benefits of learning through COVID is implementing some hybrid technology. So our speakers are joining us remotely from their offices elsewhere in the state of New Hampshire. And we also have some of the attendees participating virtually as well. Pass it to Joe, who's the chair of our Resiliency Roundtable, our Resiliency Subcommittee, just to say a couple words.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, the roundtable is today.
Yes.
The organization subcommittee. I'd like to thank everybody for attending today. Basically, what happened here and how we formed the Resiliency Subcommittee is everybody's been concerned, obviously, about what happens when something like a tornado or a flood or something happens. How do we recover from that? And that's obviously something that we've been planning for on an ongoing basis. What we found in the last year and a half with the COVID situation is maybe we need to be thinking about it more than how do we react when something happens and start to look at things more from a resiliency point of view. How do we find out whether or not we're ready from a resiliency point of view? So we're doing things on an ongoing basis that helps us when we get into these kinds of situations. So that was one of the reasons that we formed the subcommittee. We sent out a survey about 6 months ago, and people responded. We're very pleased with that. The number one issue that came up from a resiliency point of view was water. And so based on that, we decided to have this particular roundtable, and we're pleased we're going to have a couple of guests with us today. Again, thanks everybody for attending, and we'll have an opportunity for people to interact as we go along. So again, thank you very much, and Nancy, over to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to give a quick introduction to our speakers. We've got Annie Ropeik. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. So Annie joined NHPR as the Energy and Environment Reporter in 2017. She founded the newsroom's Climate Change Reporting Project, 5 Degrees, in 2020, and recently co-hosted a special podcast series with NHPR's Outside In called Windfall. Annie also covers the Seacoast and manages climate reporting projects for the NPR stations of the New England News Collaborative. She is a graduate of Boston University and grew up outside Washington, D.C. And Ted Diers, good morning, Ted, for being with us. Ted is the administrator of the Watershed Management Bureau of the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. The Bureau includes 20 programs dedicated to achieving Clean Water Act goals, integrating science, data, policy, land use, and education to improve the condition of the state's lakes, rivers, wetlands, and tidal waters. He previously served as manager of the New Hampshire Coastal Program, the state's coastal zone management program. Over the past 24 years, he has focused his work on state and federal ocean policy, salt marsh and river restoration projects, assisting in revisions of state regulations, managing controversial and diverse issues, and facilitating, this is a lot of words, numerous planning efforts. He received his BA in Economics and Political Science from Ripon College, and he also earned a master's from the Yale University School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Thank you guys very much. I will hand it over to you, Annie, first. If you'd like to start off. Welcome.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. So I just have like a few slides. Nancy, if you want to toss those up, just talking a little bit about the kind of drought coverage that we've been doing and sort of what I've been seeing.
I need to share the screen. Okay, just a second.
Yeah, no problem.
So you can expand that box.
Yep.
Cool. So I just wanted to kind of, by way of showing how I've been following the drought for the past year plus, and I think kind of how like many members of the public have been following it by extension. This was the first story that we did about what I consider to be the current sort of drought cycle. So this was February 2020. And I believe that Tom O'Donovan probably pitched me on this. Tom, who recently retired from DES with Ted, was the water bureau director, and he and his colleagues, including Ted, continued to be very good about letting me know when there is something related to the drought that we're not talking about that we should be covering more. And this, dated back to before the drought was even a twinkle in most of our eyes, when we had this low snowpack winter over 2019 to 2020. We were in that weird netherworld between the primary and the start of the pandemic. It was just like a completely lost news time to me. But this is something that happened during then, that Tom just, tossed us this little line about, we had kind of a dry winter. This is how that can influence drought. For sort of communication purposes, I would just note that Tom and his colleagues, including Ted again, were always very good about showing me sort of data related to this and really walking me through all of the sort of trends and factors, from soil moisture to lake water levels that kind of illustrate that a drought is developing or what a drought is doing. So for some of you, as stakeholders, like that's one takeaway I would leave you with, just in communicating with the media and the public, is it's great to bring numbers and to sort of show me evidence, because it helps me explain to people, especially when it's, raining during a drought, that it is still going on. I can't count the number of times in the past year that I've written the words, New Hampshire's drought is, has continued or has worsened despite recent rain. Although in the past few weeks, that has actually been the first time that we've had substantial rain that I have managed to write, like, the rain has actually done something to the drought, and we're still sort of working on explaining to people like why this time is different. But so this was the first story that we did. I don't think this made much of a splash. People are not really thinking about drought. I mean, in New England, hardly at all, let alone in February. And then I'll just show you some of the stories we've done since then, if you want to go to the next slide. So this is just an example. I just quickly scrolled through our drought tag and looked at how many stories we've done. And there have been plenty more updates about the drought that have only gone on the radio, just really quick, like 30-second long things, or it's gone in the weather forecast or something like that, that we have not posted online. But I tried to post a lot of the drought stories online. People did seem interested in them. We would routinely get 1,000 hits on a very, very short drought story, the likes of which the sort of length of the kind that I just showed before this, and some of them got quite a bit more play, and it was very hard to tell sort of which ones would do well. I think it kind of depended on the headline. It depended on, like, if it had been a really dry feeling week, in addition to there being some sort of interesting change in the drought trends, people would really pick up on that and share it. But these are some examples of stories that we did since basically over the course of 2020 and now into this spring. Our Spanish language newscast project, Que de Nuevo, New Hampshire, translated 14 of those into Spanish, which is really exciting. And they distribute that newscast on the text app WhatsApp, and also post the stories in Spanish online. So it's been cool to see some of these translated. We would see the ones about human impacts, I would say, sort of do the best on our website, generate the most engagement on our social media channels. When the Exchange, may it rest in peace, would talk about the drought, we would get calls that related to how people were experiencing it. So dry wells and farmers, and people seeing like a lake level that was really low. And I also saw that reflected in just how I was able to drum up new stories and even just photos about the drought. So little things to kind of advance the story and keep it on people's minds. I mean, we were trying really hard, including at the urging of DES, to keep this on people's minds, because it, especially in late fall 2020, as I'm sure all of you know, was a pretty bad situation, and an uncommonly bad situation for New Hampshire, although we've seen, I believe, about 3 of these bad situations, sort of extreme or severe droughts, that have lasted many months in the past 20 years. But I sourced a lot of photos on Facebook, and like WMUR runs their U-Local channel, and we would, you know, borrow photos from there. We would do call outs in some of these stories, ask people to send us, you know, what are you seeing? If you take a photo of your dry lawn, send us that and we'll use it. I would just ask my coworkers, like, take a picture of your backyard. I mean, plenty of the photos that went with these stories were just NHPR staff. I mean, this one at the bottom in the middle, the drought, streams, rivers, walls, and farmers, that's the Rockingham Country Club golf course in like Newfields, Newmarket, where I used to live. And I drive by there every day and kind of like keep an eye on the grass and see it getting browner and browner. So I take pictures of that sometimes. And then we did do some longer stories. If you want to go to the next slide, last of my 3 slides. So this one on the top left was sort of the big feature that we did about the drought last fall. This woman in the picture, Jen, who lives in Hooksett, I did find on a Facebook page. She had posted some pictures, I want to say, of Lake Messabasic, just looking really dry. You know, there was that couple of weeks where the water level in I think it was Messabasic, was so low that there was like treasures being unearthed in like the intertidal, you know, part of the lake or the shoreline. I messaged Jen to ask if I could use her pictures, and she mentioned that she was having some well issues. So I went and visited her. You know, we looked at the dead ferns in the backyard and the dry well and talked about how that was affecting her during the pandemic. And it really became an infrastructure story as well as a climate change one. So those are really the sort of big themes that I needed to tie in reporting on a drought last year, were the pandemic, and then looking at drought as an infrastructure problem, because I mean, what can we do about a drought besides look at how water is distributed and delivered and conserved? And that's an infrastructure question. And this was before, you know, the election. It was before the Biden infrastructure bill, but you know, the saying in Washington, it's always infrastructure week, like applies here. And then climate change, of course. And I've really made an extremely concerted effort in the past couple of years to keep climate change top of mind for NHPR. I think it's my responsibility as an environmental journalist to tie it in, you know, where I can, where it's relevant, to show people why it's relevant in places they might not expect, and to help people understand why, you know, seemingly strange or anomalous occurrences like, you know, 3 extreme droughts in the Northeast in 20 years are in line with the warming and volatility trends of climate change, and why scientists say we will likely see more of them in the future, even as we get wetter, which is a very hard thing to explain. But you know, the line I've repeated over and over is we'll see more precipitation overall, but it will come in heavier bouts, more sporadically, with little dry spells in between that will lead to droughts like the one that we have been seeing now and quickly stopped seeing in July, as we suddenly got a dump of feet of rain, which also is in line with these same trends. And then just in the past couple of months, I've really turned to the wildfire connection here. It's something that NPR National has been very interested in. And when they got wind that, you know, the Northeast was experiencing a drought and thinking about fire impacts in places like the White Mountains, they were really interested in that. So I've been working on a series that's wrapping up soon with NPR about wildfires basically outside the West. And, you know, it's all connected to increasing temperatures, increasing risk of droughts. Those all are factors that drive wildfire risk, even in otherwise wet places like the White Mountains. This is an NPR podcast that included some of that reporting, and then the local version of an NPR story I did about some prescribed burn work that's going on in Conway in the Whites. And there will be another big NPR piece about that coming out in a couple of weeks. But the wildfire impacts, I think, have been interesting to tie in. You know, last fall at the height of the drought, that was also the height of fire season in like California and Oregon. And it was really on people's minds. And, you know, there were little fires cropping up in New Hampshire, and there are always little fires cropping up in New Hampshire, but we gave it a little extra attention because it was something people were we're wanting to know more about, paying more attention to, is an opportunity for us to remind people that this can happen here and that these droughts, you know, affect that. And they affect the availability of water for firefighting, and that it comes back to the infrastructure questions. So, and then just to hand off to Ted, I mean, the other thing I remember most from this infrastructure piece is the idea of resiliency. So the idea of making water more available in more ways, with the Southern New Hampshire Regional Interconnection Project, the new pipeline being an example of that, you know, towns that might rely on one well water source that is sensitive to drought, you know, would do well to have another public water source or add another well or connect to another town's bigger surface water supply. Anything to diversify and give yourself a backup is what I was told is sort of the best way that we can get ready for more of this volatility, because like I said, you know, you can't stop that there are going to be these trends. Obviously, there are things we can and should do to curb the effects of climate change, but we're going to see more of these trends regardless. And so, you know, making more fallbacks and redundancies are going to be our best way to take advantage of the fact that we are generally water rich, but making sure that water all gets where it needs to go when it's needed most. So those are sort of my observations. You know, happy to answer questions after Ted speaks, but I think he's got more of the data and maybe can tell us about what the drought is doing today, because that's the story I have to do today.
Great, well, thanks, Annie, appreciate it. Can everybody hear me okay? You know, out there in TV land? All right, excellent. So it's great to be with you. I know certainly a number of you, and then, you know, it's great to see you here, and I wish I was there. I think it is fun to start to be able to be in the same places, but it's also really handy to be able to share presentations and such remotely with these sort of hybrid meetings. So I am going to talk a little bit about the data that we use when we're thinking about drought. And I'm going to start with our Drought Monitor, because that's the thing that most people do. And I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen here. So let's go ahead and, oh, can I do that? I don't see a button for that. Oh, there it is. Never mind. That's the big green one. It says disabled. Can you guys hook me up?
We're working on it.
Okay.
Do you have permission? Can you do it?
Yep, I'm good. Thanks. Okay, can you see that okay? Great. So I'm going to talk about the Drought Monitor, and I think this is a really good place to start because it kind of talks about a whole number of different things that I think are interesting when we start to think about how do we communicate drought and how do we actually track it. So how do we know where we are in these conditions? So, you know, Annie did a great job of laying this out, is that we are in the midst of a multi-year drought. And that is very, it's relatively unique for the Northeast. And it's really the communication challenge that I think we'll talk more about, and Annie did a great job of talking about it, is that this is a slow motion disaster. So you don't want to get too freaked out too quickly or try to, you know, get people to overcompensate too quickly, because you slowly get into, and I think everybody can appreciate this after, you know, a year and a half of COVID, is you get into disaster fatigue. And so one of the things that we try to really do is to keep a measured approach and try to make sure that we're having the right kinds of actions relative to the right kinds of conditions, which requires us to understand those conditions pretty well. So the Drought Monitor comes out on a Thursday. This is sort of the inside baseball about how this happens. So the drought monitor comes out on Thursday, and I have there on the left, you see today's drought monitor. So this just came out. This came out this morning at 8 o'clock. And you see that the area of abnormally dry, which is this D0, which is the yellow, is in the sort of middle part of the state, and the D1 is in the northern part of the state. And you see that northern Coas County is in actually severe drought. That's D2. And we'll get back to that in a second. And so what happens is that on Sunday night, I start getting emails, as well as a couple of other folks in our state. And we start getting emails that say, hey, this is what we're seeing for the drought monitor for this coming week. And the people around the region weigh in, and this comes out of the weather service from NOAA, out of Cornell, and out of other places around the region. And they're gathering all the data that they're going to look at in order to make the chart. And they start drawing. They actually just start drawing on these maps, sending them around, getting review from people out in the world, and understanding what goes on. And then by Tuesday, it's starting to get solidified. And by Wednesday night, they will have created this drought monitor, and then it gets released on Thursday morning. And this happens while we're in significant drought conditions. This gets, lots and lots of people are weighing in on, whether or not Cape Cod should be, red at what point. Should it be from Eastham, or should it be from Truro? And the same is true in New Hampshire, where we're trying to say, where should that line go across? And there's a little bit of art in this. I think there's a little voodoo here and there, but largely it's based on science. I also again, I'm going to come back to this thought about, we have a lot of diversity of climate within this little state. And you can see that the map or the monitor that's a year ago, the drought monitor from 2020, you see a very different picture of drought than you see today. You see that the southern part of the state, and especially your area of the state, was really suffering. And I think this is important, and we'll talk about this in a second. So I'm going to just kind of quickly go through and talk a little bit about some of the data that goes into all of this. And then I'll tell you where you can find this for yourself. And just, if anybody has questions along the way, just holler, just, whatever, shoot either, just somebody holler out to me. So.
Ted, this is Jen. I'm just going to do a little housekeeping. You're in presenter mode, so we're seeing your current slide and the next slide. And if you can switch, it will make things a little bit bigger.
That's weird. I don't know why that is. How do I get out of that here? Let's see. I think the problem is I have two screens. Better?
You got it.
Is that better?
That is much better. Thanks, Ted.
Okay, good. Sorry about that.
Question.
Yeah.
What is your definition of drought?
So, I think that's an interesting question. And you'll see as we go through this, I think we'll get an answer to that. I don't know that there's one definition of drought. And this is part of the problem, is that it is there's a lot of aspects to it. And we'll see that there's issues related to storm. There's issues related to surface waters. There's issues related to groundwater. There's soil conditions. All of these add up to become that, that picture. So, drought is more of it's more of a syndrome than it is a particular disease. And I think that's kind of important to remember as we go through this. So we'll come back around and maybe together we answer that question. So one of the things that we try to look a lot at is, what is the departure from normal? And kind of normal is a weird term, but we basically look back at history and we spend a lot of time looking at what were things like over time on this day in history, because you can't compare June 21st to April 21st in any particular year because the conditions would be different. Very different parts of the hydrologic year and temperature and everything else going on. So we tend to look back over longer periods of time. This is a great picture because it shows that there's also pretty tremendous changes from different parts of the even the Northeast. So between Caribou, Maine and Providence, Rhode Island, and you see Concord in green here, that over the last year, even with many of the rains that we've just had, we're still 5 inches below for over the course of the last 13 months or so. So we were deep in drought, a multi-year drought, and this still indicates what that looks like over the long period of time. And you can see that dramatic, at the end of that curve on the green line, going up over since the beginning of June. And this is that departure data. This was last week, or I guess, yeah, this was last week. Just looking at, if you look at just the year from the beginning of January until now, you can see that we've now gone above what would be sort of the normal line and average line. But yet, if you take us back a year, we're still a couple inches below that. So while we've caught up, we were catching up from a very deep hole. Not going to worry too much about that. Temperatures, this is also really one of the things that we look at is, where are we relative to normal temperatures? This shows temperature observed ranges. And the more time we spend outside of the brown color, this above that, that's telling us that we're having abnormally high temperatures. And you can see that throughout much of June, we did have a significant number of days that were very much out of the norm. This is precipitation received, and these maps look very different now than they did a month ago, where the map to the left would be in all yellows and reds, and now it's all greens. But when you look at the past 30 days, the tip of Coos County still is well below normal. These are some really interesting groundwater comparisons that we did, and we're going to do this again next week. But what we're looking at here is we're looking at comparing the droughts in 2016 to 2020 to 2021. Oops, sorry about that. And what you see here is that certainly in May, and this was just a picture from May, is that the 2021 numbers in our groundwater. So these are the 24. This just happened to be Deerfield, but we have 24 groundwater monitoring wells around the state. And this shows the Deerfield one and the Concord one. And you can see that 2021 was much deeper. The groundwater has gone down further in 2021 than it had in 20 and it had in 2016. So again, this is indication of what is normal and where are we relative to normal, because that's really the definition of drought, is kind of where are we relative to where we normally would be. And this has interesting implications. I think that this is, kind of the nature of this conversation, that normal is changing. Normal is changing around us. And the statistics that we use to determine normal are statistics that go back, probably, it depends on how long you use the records, but it could be back as far as 80 years, 90 years, 100 years on some of the places around the state where we have that much data. And again, this is showing more of that, where we were in 2020, 2021 relative to the intensity of the drought as measured by the Drought Monitor. And you can see that this lines up pretty nicely, is that when, and that's because it should, because this data goes into determining the Drought Monitor. So you can see where the reds are is where we definitely had lower groundwater levels. But again, we want to know where it is to normal, because over the course of the summer, groundwater levels go down every year. So that's part of the complicating factor. So this is one of my favorite graphs, but it's very hard to confuse. It's very hard to convince anybody else that it means anything because it's kind of complicated. So what we did on this is that we have combined the various different stream gauges. So this is surface water. These are stream gauges, and we combined them by region. And then we've run statistics. So what we're looking at is we're looking at the statistics of where on each day, each Julian day, where is this relative to all other water flows on that Julian day? And we're putting them in percentiles. So at the bottom, you can see here in May and all of June is that most of the state was down into the lowest 5 or 10% of all flows throughout the history of us looking at flows. And that's a history that goes back probably, in some cases 50 or 60 years. So looking across that data, we see that we were in the lowest 5 or 10% ever measured. And in fact, through June, the North Country saw many of its lowest records ever measured. And then we see what happens in July as the rains begin to hit. And now we have most of the state above the median, up into the 70, 80, 90th percentile of rainfall for these days. So it's really, really wet now. I would also point out that you can see these crazy fluctuations. Those crazy fluctuations are management of water systems. So this is the Androscoggin and the Connecticut and other places which are which are highly managed. So these are interesting, you get these interesting anomalies within the data that make it also very challenging to understand what's going on here. And this just shows those same gauges that we are in some cases up to 80% above where we were in a year ago. So again, this July has been very, very wet. Shifting gears a little bit to what do we do about all of this? We have an in-stream flow program at the state. And what the in-stream flow program does is it sets for designated rivers. You have a couple of them in your region, the Isinglass and the Cachiko. For those designated rivers, we go through an intense scientific process where we establish a protected in-stream flow. So that protected in-stream flow gives you a number. This shows this is actually in cubic feet per second per mile. It's a measurement that we use to be able to look at water flow at any particular day. And it looks at duration. So you can see that during certain times when it was below these what we call catastrophic events or the rare protected flow, these flows are when we gets below this, we know it's abnormally low. And that's always the challenge here, is how do you separate normally low from abnormally low? And so that's what the in-stream flow program does, is it creates what is abnormally low. And then we look at how long is it below that. So you can see some of these red areas, and this is where we were significantly below our protected in-stream flows. And when that happens in rivers that have gone through this process, it creates a series of actions. So this happens to be the Lamprey River. So when we go into one of these periods in which we're below the protected in-stream flow, we notify all the water users in that watershed that they need to begin following their water management plan. So as part of this program, we've written water management plans in cooperation with all of these water users, and it will say what they're going to do when we get to that point. So they begin to conserve water, and they begin to have outdoor watering bans, and they begin to do other things and seeking alternative sources, as Andy talked about, being more resilient. We also have the ability to release water. And so we release water from Pawtuckaway Lake and from Mendham's Pond in order to augment river flow when it gets very, very dry. And the purpose of that is to mimic a rainstorm to benefit the aquatic life within the river. And we're starting to do these studies now. We've done them in the Sauhegan and the Lamprey. We're about to finish up in the Cold River. We're moving next the Warner River's under work now, and then we'll move to the Ashuelot next year. So someday we'll get out to the Isinglass and the Kachiko and begin to set some of these. And then the last thing I'll say about this is that in the 2016 drought, the people along the Lamprey were starting to do conservation measures a month ahead of everyone else because they had this kind of data, this kind of information that let them know that they were headed into a drought. And I'm kind of going to just do one other quick thing here, and that is to just finish up with groundwater. So this is the map from last month. This is June. And you can see that almost everywhere across the state, this pinks and oranges are below normal for, again, and they're compared to normal for that particular time of year. And this is why, even after, what was it? We had like 18 out of 22 days of rain in July. This is why we still have droughts. The Drought Monitor still shows drought in New Hampshire, is because our groundwater got so low that it's going to take a very, very long time to recharge. And until we're going to monitor again next week. Next week we'll have a new picture and see where we're at. But right now we're still in a groundwater drought in the state, even while our surface waters are flooding. And that's one of the very difficult things to communicate. So I'm going to stop there, and then we can jump into discussion. So, but I'll see if there's any other questions while I got the data still up.
All right, so do we have any questions for Ted or Annie?
I do have one question.
Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yep, hear you great.
The chart that you showed, I think it was the one right before this, and you said that it's somewhat, keep going back, it was the one that most people would have a hard time, right there. I think that's it. Can you just, while that chart is there, some of the ways you seem to be able to get this data to give people a heads up when they should start conservation measures earlier, is the ability to do that affected by the existence of dams, things like dams that, you know, when there's a lot of rain, you know, it holds some of the water back from running off? Does the existence of dams, and I think about, and I won't get into this, but the argument people have about removing dams, fixing dams and this and that, do you need to have those kinds of structures in place to be able to put together these kinds of meaningful charts?
Not really. I mean, we do have a number. So I'll just tell you, if I want to know a quick shot about what's going on for water quality or for water quantity across the state, what I normally do is I have a set of gauges that I know of that are not regulated. That is, that they don't have dams which are able to regulate the water in those particular water bodies. The one that's closest to you is the Oyster River. So you want to know what I go look on Monday morning when I want to know kind of what's going on with water flow in the seacoast. I go to the Oyster. And the reason why I go to the Oyster is that it has essentially no regulation on it. And in the middle part of the state, I go to the Warner. You know, and there's other places around that I go and look at. But that said, there aren't very many places in the state where we have the ability to actually change water flow dramatically. Most of the dams in the state, and all of the dams that have ever been removed, are essentially run-of-river dams. So these are dams that whatever water comes in goes out, essentially. Now that's, you know, and that's not quite true on some of the lakes, some of the bigger lakes, but even those, once you get to the elevation of the lake that they're essentially trying to manage to, once you get to that level, water that goes in goes out, with the exception of evaporation. So we in this state, and this is one of the major differences, and this is, I think, one of the important things to talk about relative to some like the California situation, is that we don't have storage. The minimal storage we have is actually in the ground. And even that is really minimal compared to places that have giant reservoirs, like down in the southeastern part of this country and in the West. we don't have storage. We have lots of ponds. We have 1,000 lakes and ponds, but all of those have relatively little water in them and not enough water to really change downstream water flow very much. Which is why we use them only in really deep droughts, because it takes a lot less water at that point. So the issue about dams is that we really don't have very much control. There are some flood control facilities around. You're probably familiar with, the Hopkinton, Everett, over in the Sauhegan. There's a number of them, but again, they're just taking the edge off of big floods. They don't have much of an effect on really what's in the stream from day to day, except during very dry periods when they're not releasing water. That's actually the bigger issue. You look at Pawtuckaway Lake is 15% of that watershed. It sits above Pawtuckaway. In the summer, they're not really releasing any water. So that means 15% of the water that would normally be going into the Lamprey River is trapped. And so these are some of the issues that come up when you start talking about kind of drought and long-term management.
Thank you for that. I think it's because I'm quite familiar from fishing that what happens with the Bellamy Reservoir, which is right in my neck of the woods here.
Right.
I was curious about that because I think that might be one of those kind of exceptions. There is some impact because it's a pretty significant reservoir, and they do a lot with the monitoring the water that comes out of there. You can see it from the river on the other side of the dam. So, but anyway, thank you very much.
Well, I think that's a good point. And the issue there is that, again, during the summer, once the water gets below essentially the top of the dam, it doesn't really feed, except for leakage. It's not really feeding the Bellamy River. So it is holding water back, but the amount that's being used doesn't really have that much impact on the Bellamy because it's already below the top of the dam. So you don't really get flow again until there's a big rainstorm that fills up the lake and then spills over. And so the Bellamy is very much a challenged river relative to flow, simply because it has such a huge amount of its area, its recharge area is locked up behind the reservoir. So yeah, once it's kind of locked up, what they actually use within it doesn't affect the Bellamy very much.
We have a couple questions, a couple hands I've seen. So we've got Tim, then Mike, Joe, and Mark.
Thanks, Shannon. Hey, Ted, nice to see you.
Hey, Tim, good to see you.
Yeah, so I've said this a million times in other meetings, but I came into planning through meteorology, which is another question. I wouldn't even bother explaining how I got here. At any rate, so I tend to be hypersensitive to things like, rainfall, just from my past life. But what I've never really understood is something that you started to talk about, and you said you're going to, I think, look at it later this week, is the groundwater recharge side of this, where,
right.
I look back at data showing, we've been below normal, from significantly below normal, pretty much from 2015 right up through 2020. I think 2018 we were normal or a little bit above in terms of precipitation. So I tend to go outside and yell at my neighbors for watering their lawn. And, they're looking at me like I'm crazy. And then, I go out there in July and it's rained like crazy and I'm yelling at them for watering their lawn because they don't need to. And we still haven't really caught up on groundwater. And I'm just,
right.
So I struggle with the messaging, not only from me yelling at my neighbors, but just from the Rockingham Planning Commission's perspective, as we work with our communities and they try to navigate, the data that you put out. I tend to be maybe overly conservative, saying, no, you need to stop. You just need to keep the water restrictions in place until we can catch up from this multi-year event.
Right. And I agree. I think what happens, and this is what happened the first couple weeks, well, at least the first week of rain in July, is that the ground was so dry and that we have so much vegetation going on right now, and the temperatures were still pretty high, that most of the rain that fell was either evapotranspirated out. That is, the trees took it up and it evaporated, or the trees just blocked the rain as it came down. And then the soil was so dry that when it gets that dry and it has a sudden rainstorm, it tends to shed that water. And so you get immediate runoff. So you see these giant, these giant spikes, and you see these in the stream flow. But you don't see is that really filling up the aquifer. It doesn't fill up the overburden, that which sits above bedrock. And that's really so we're, after a couple of weeks of rain, especially steady, drizzly, vacation ruining kind of rain, that's when you start to actually see it kind of start to soak in and gets deep. I know I didn't have to water my garden for a while because it was soaked all the way down through. And that's when you start to get some recharge. But frankly, just because of the evaporative and the transpirative, if that's a word, forces, because we have so many stinking trees, that we don't really start to recharge until the trees start to shut down at the end of September. And
Right.
that's so what I'm really looking for, Tim, and this is for the meteorology geeks, is I'm really looking to see what the weather is going to be like in October and November. And then we're going to, and Annie talked about this, we're going to be following very, very closely the snowpack next year, because those are the really key determinations. So, we also could have, the wild cards in all of this are the tropical depressions. And, we could not have predicted hurricane or tropical storm Elsa. So what's really, I think, fun in kind of a mental, intellectual way, and this gets back to your meteorological geek side, is that the weather in Africa, off the coast of Africa, is what really will influence where we are for the rest of the summer.
I remember, just to pop in on that Tom O'Donovan, Tom O'Donovan has been my drought contact, so he's still very fresh in my mind on all of this. He's with us today. Last summer or late fall, when Storm Isaias happened and it was slamming southern New England, Tom was very aggrieved that he thought it was going to hit us, and then it just swung just around us, and we stayed in a drought. He was sort of hoping that would give us some rain. So those big summer fall storms, definitely are an interesting factor.
Yeah, Ted, you said that the nature of all this rain in July has been very intense, very rapid. And as you said, with the dry soil, the runoff happens as you're showing on the screen. So, you're right. You need some vacation ruining rain, and we'll wait for October for that, hopefully.
Yep.
Okay, Mike Levinsky.
Actually, sorry, not Mark. Brian had a follow-up to Dave on the Bellamy, and then we'll go quickly to Mike.
Oh, okay. I'll wait.
Morning. Am I able to be heard here via remote?
Hey, whatever Brian wants, Brian gets.
So Ted, we do allow water. There is water that goes through the Bellamy when it stops going over the dam. So, and Al Pratt, our water supply operator, water resource manager, does everything he can to try to match the flow going in. And we use the Oyster River. So it's that 85, 87 years of record, which is very helpful in seeing where trends are going. So, there is some, it's minimal because of, it's dry, it's low flow, and when it does go over, stop going over the dam, there's still some flow through.
A little bit, yeah. I appreciate the correction, Brian. I didn't mean to sound Portsmouth. I'm sorry. Hey, Mike.
Morning, Ted. Thank you. Appreciate your remarks, along with Annie's as well. It's very timely and interesting. When you were discussing river monitoring measurements and services through your agency, what I didn't hear you say, and maybe I missed it, was anything about the Salmon Falls. And I know the genesis of the Salmon Falls actually is in Maine, I think, with the dam up there. It borders New Hampshire and Maine. So is that a jurisdictional thing, or because I know we get some data, there is some river gauges in there, and I can't remember if my staff is getting that from the state of Maine or from you. I thought it was from the state of New Hampshire, but
Well, when we compile all that stuff, we don't really care. We use gauges in Vermont.
Okay.
We use gauges wherever we can find them that have good data. So we may well use some of those gauges, wherever they are the best ones. We oftentimes find that, especially in the along the Connecticut River, that actually some of the Vermont gauges are actually better at predicting kind of where we're at than some of the New Hampshire ones.
Okay.
You go ahead.
I was going to say, are you tracking then the Salmon Falls?
I don't know if I can't remember if we're particularly tracking that one or not, but yeah, that's something that, we definitely, would be looking at.
Yeah. I mean, that's obviously that's where Somersworth generates its water supply. So.
Right. And, I think it's an interesting, you bring this up, and we talked about this a little bit before, is that this idea of diversifying your water supply, of, having a whole variety of different, supplies. And I think, our poster child for this is Durham, who have a water withdrawal in the lamprey, they have a water withdrawal in the oyster, and they have an aquifer recharge that they've created. And that gives them the ability that when the lamprey hits its in-stream flow mark and the oyster gets really low, that they have another alternative. And I know a lot of communities are trying to head that way. It's just really seriously expensive business developing new water sources.
Well, yeah, and
nobody knows that better than you guys.
Yeah, and just to add to that, so we collaborated with the city of Dover probably 2 years ago, I think, with regard to an emergency interconnect.
Right.
Associated with some improvements to the Willan Pond pumping station that Dover was working on, and we have a cross-country water main that's nearby. It was a perfect opportunity to look at how we could formalize an emergency interconnect. And we did that actually. The city of Dover applied for a grant through your agency actually, and they were funded for design and construction of that component, as well as their needs for their pump station at Willan Pond. But it's certainly for emergency use only, and to the extent that any of their aquifers have problems, which I know they're dealing with, this is a backup plan. Conversely, if we ever had a problem in the Salmon Falls, we would have the ability to draw water from them. It's very specific. We worked through a pretty elaborate water intermunicipal agreement that limits how much what we can provide for each city, but it's all based on emergency. And so I think it's helpful for the long run.
Well, and Annie mentioned the Southern New Hampshire connection piece, and that is I like to say a watershed moment, because communities notoriously don't want to, are protective of their water, and
Sure.
And that makes sense. You have to be. You have ratepayers, you have voters, and they spend a lot of money to develop those sources. And very few towns are in a position where they have such an abundance of water that they want to sell it. So it is, but we are starting to see some cracks in that, where people are starting to see a regionally developed water sources. There are opportunities for that, intermunicipal agreements, interconnections. So I think that's starting to kind of come around a little bit, especially in places that are especially water poor. Yeah. Southern New Hampshire happens to have unfortunate geography and geology, that it's just very water poor. And again, that's always surprising to people in New Hampshire, a place that gets 50 inches of rain a year, that we have water poverty.
Yeah. Thank you.
Joe, do you have a question?
Yeah, Ted, you're talking about the quantity of water and that sort of thing. With the aquifer going down, do you track the quality as well?
I think that's a big gap. I appreciate you asking that question. We have some groundwater monitoring for water quality normally associated with water supplies. So most of the data we have is associated with the water you drink. And so to that extent, we do have some really great data. But in terms of just ambient monitoring, we don't have ambient water quality monitoring of the groundwater the way we do on surface waters. For a variety of reasons. One is it's much harder to get, and it's expensive to process, and it just takes a lot of time to try to do that. And we have such a good network of volunteer monitors, for our surface waters, that we have a better opportunities to do some of that. But even on those surface waters, we don't really monitor for chemical constituents, metals, things like that on a regular basis, because it's so expensive and we just simply don't have the resources to do so.
I just to jump in on that, did a really interesting story about a study from the USGS several months ago that shows that arsenic concentrations tend to become higher in groundwater in a drought, which is pretty intuitive. Less water, the arsenic that's in there becomes more concentrated. But as I'm sure many of you know, this is a huge problem up here. We just have all this naturally occurring arsenic. We're very well water reliant, and so this is an interesting factor for us to consider, I think. And I know that the researcher said one of the upshots of this is potentially just messaging more well water testing during droughts. People should always be doing more well water testing in states like New Hampshire, but especially when those concentrations might be higher. I'll put the link to that in the chat.
Really good point, because weird things happen when water levels underground drop significantly. You really can change your water sources fairly rapidly, especially in bedrock where you're hitting different fractures at different levels. And you can really radically change your water quality from day to day, depending on where it is within that well. And the other things that happen is that as you start to change those reactions, as you start to change the sort of redox potential, you also have the opportunity to mobilize other things like lead, which may be in the water lines. So, there are a lot of risks associated with water quality, and most of them are not well understood. And, we don't have great ways of being able to track them except through the major, community supplied water sources, which do intense monitoring.
To that point, Ted, I was just going to say that we can measure it for the city of Rochester, because we can go to our water folks and say, are you using more chemicals? Are you doing this, that, to take things out? But to Annie's point, it's the wells that I think are the real concern, because we're not monitoring those. We're dependent on each user to be monitoring it. And so that may be a real missed opportunity.
Yeah, and we have, we did create last year an assistance program for low-income folks who lose their well, for the wells that go dry, so that they can have dollars to go dig new wells or drill new wells. And we've, I think, funded about 110 or so people around the state over the last 15 months, a year. I guess it's just been a year to do that, and that's a really important piece. But yeah, we have something on the order of, it's about 50% self-supplied in the state, and they're totally, that's the live free or die. You supply your own water, and it's your responsibility to try to test it. And the problem occurs in people who may not have the means or to understand that they need to do that. There's also, I get calls from people who say, hey, I get my water from an underground river. I was like, well, no, you don't. There's just not a great understanding of how can you drill into granite 500 feet down and water shows up out of the rock. That's a pretty baffling concept. I think even when I try to think about it, it still kind of is like, we get water out of rock? How is that possible? So, these are not, they're not inherent in people's understanding.
And I think the idea of the shared resource is really hard to communicate too. I got an email from a listener that I still want to follow up on, who said, we're on a private well. We've been being very conservative throughout the drought because we're worried it's going to run dry, but the credit union down the road is watering their lawn. And like, they are also on a private well, and so they don't have to follow the local restrictions, or the local restrictions are voluntary, and that's all the same aquifer, so those kinds of things affect each other, and there are limits to what those local restrictions can do because those wells are unregulated. And like Ted said, the live free or die thing of it. And so many of these homeowners, I mean, I don't think that the sort of nature of many of these wells are often very well communicated when people move into houses. I mean, it's very hit and miss if people coming from out of state or from somewhere that is completely never heard of a private well, move here, how much they understand, like what it means that their well is dug versus drilled, or that it's drilled but tends to run dry in certain conditions, and just the really high cost to dealing with that when it comes around. And the state has this emergency aid program going on right now for dry wells, which is great and has been, I think continue to be used this year. Ted, is that right?
Yeah.
But it's sort of the kind of thing people don't necessarily think about until the water stops coming out of the tap, and then it's like, what planet am I living on here?
Well, and I'll tell you right now, what's really interesting is we hear from the well drillers a fair bit, and the well drillers right now are so busy that most of them are not taking on replacement wells, even in the drought. And that's because of the sort of COVID migration or climate migration. I don't know, Andy, you can tell us which one it is at this point, but there's a COVID migration certainly going on. And so many people have bought houses in New Hampshire and are renovating houses in New Hampshire and deepening wells and doing all of that, that it is brutal to get a well driller right now. Or pipe. It's also hard to get pipe.
I know someone did want us to talk a little bit about climate migration. Could I do that now?
That was almost a good segue, wasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, to your point, Ted, it is definitely a mix. I mean, and I think moreover, COVID migration is seen as a sort of test run for climate migration, or an example of what's to come in the Northeast. I talked to a couple last year who moved from Nevada to Rumney to get away from wildfire smoke, because one of them had health problems sensitive to the smoke and the bad air quality days, and moved out here where we've had wildfire haze 2 summers in a row. And it, she's okay, but she was surprised that she ran right back into a drought out here coming from the Southwest and had to deal with that. Towns, I think, are seeing this insane housing crush as a practice run for what happens when people, something gives in California with these fire seasons and people really start to move en masse, or maybe even moreover when the flooding gets really bad in Boston and New York and people start to move up the Northeast corridor. I think Vermont, especially since it's not coastal, is thinking about this even more, but most of New Hampshire isn't coastal either. And there are certainly benefits that could come to towns from what folks expect to happen. You could diversify your population, you could get more younger workers, but you have to prepare for that too with affordable housing and infrastructure. The folks in Vermont are thinking a lot about zoning because they don't have like very consistent statewide zoning policies, and water availability, and communicating like what water availability actually means. And like, you may still have a well that can run dry, is important for any new arrival. But yeah, the housing crush right now is really intense, and for renters as well as buyers. So it's interesting. I think a lot of those well drilling companies are probably working through their backlog from the drought and coming right into this. And I'll be interested to see, I mean, if we get a really big population bump from all the moving around going on right now, what that does to water supplies in different parts of the state. Because like we said, these aquifers are shared local resources. And do we have a sense of at what sort of point we would start to see usage really affecting that supply, Ted? I mean, is that something that you can see happen?
I'd be happy to hear Brian talk about this as well. But, if you think about water use, especially in the summer when our water use is high, is that the vast majority of it is outdoor water use. So it takes a lot of time for an individual people. The individual people add very small increments to your water supply, especially because at the same time we have water conservation, we have leak detection that's going on. The communities are getting better at doing that. They're developing sources. So, it takes a really long time. But when people start installing lawns, and that's, I think, where you start to really see the water use dramatically increase. And I don't know, Brian, if does that resonate kind of with your experience?
Yeah, Ted, we see it here sometimes on a hot summer day. We'll see water production have to double. On a normal day, we might pump 3.5 million gallons, and on a hot, dry summer day, it's 6 million. Ironically, what we see too in our system are bigger businesses that actually use water for cooling. So some of that is cooling water. So very hot. When we saw the 90s right before this rain, we were really pushing it. But the upside so we require if anybody puts an irrigation system in, they have to have it WaterSense certified, which means they have it at least designed to be as efficient as possible, so it's not spraying water everywhere and kind of the fire hose irrigation method. And the other is, they have sensors so that, when it's raining or the soil is wet, they're not overwatering when they don't need to, which, actually when you talk to a customer and let them know that that's going to help them save money, they're all for that. And we see that, just when it started raining, in the old days, I can say the old days here because I remember my days, 20 some years ago in New Hampshire. You get water demands go up in the summer, and then they would stay that way all throughout because people didn't have automatic irrigation systems. So when it rained, irrigation people are still watering. So that really doesn't happen. So what we see, we saw water demands go right down with these recent rains. So that is a good thing. Irrigation, if it's done right, it is okay. The one upside, if we're a water system that's in really tough times meeting demand and we don't have anywhere to turn to have people reduce water, it is helpful to be able to tell people, and we get compliance when we put restrictions on. So, last year when we put restrictions on the end of the summer, we saw compliance. So you at least have somewhere to go, when you need to restrict. If it's strictly, having people flush toilets less and use less water inside, that gets really tough when you're trying to tweak down to that point.
Mark?
Yeah, we're talking about groundwater, and there's two words there, ground and water. What physically happens to the ground? And we talk about it drying out and the water sheds off, but is that the same in the wintertime if there's no snowpack? What physically happens to the ground itself that has, or does it even have an impact on this issue?
Yeah, it does. We stop recharging when the ground gets completely frozen, mostly. There's still places, there's wetlands, there's things that stay open. There's rivers that do, when they at above certain level, they are recharging a little bit here and there. They're mostly, it really depends on what the elevations are and where the groundwater is underground. Remember that we have both the overburden, the superficial unconsolidated mix that sits above the bedrock. And then you have, certainly lenses of sand that were, again, old, superficial geology, remnants from the last glacial age. And then you have bedrock itself, and the bedrock is mostly granite and it's fractured. And so, where you get the water into the overburden is mimics the surface topography. So the low spots get the water, and you have, you know, wetlands, and you have all kinds of other places. You see springs, you know, those are places where you've got the water is coming in and moving around in the overburden. How that gets into bedrock is what you spend lots and lots and lots of money with hydrogeologists trying to figure out. It's really complicated. And, you know, that's where you really have, you could be getting your water recharged for your well, could be coming from miles away, because that's where the bedrock intersects. Or it could be getting water from deep down. There's lots of different places where you're getting water in bedrock because you're just hitting fractures. It's just those fractures. And so, you know, what we see though is that there is so it takes a long time for bedrock wells to become sort of replenished. The overburden is faster because it more mimics what's going on the surface. But again, the plants have a very big role to play, as does evaporation and paved surfaces. If you pave something over, it doesn't infiltrate into the ground. And when there's ice covering everything, it doesn't infiltrate into the ground. So the key times of year for us tend to be the fall, and then into the early spring when we're starting to recharge, and we're filling up all the wetlands, and we're filling up all the, you know, the rivers and everything else, and there's lots of water around, and delaying that onset of high temperatures and low rainfall as long as possible in the spring. That's what gives us a nice normal year, if there are normal years anymore. So does that answer the question, I guess?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's something that, you know, like you said earlier, it dries out and the rainwater runs off, and we certainly notice it when we try to go out and dig in the garden and that kind of thing, that the ground is harder when it's dried out. But I'm just curious, it's always been a question to me when we talk about that aquifer and how long it can take for the surface water to get down there. What's physically happening to the earth itself during that time of drought? And so,
yeah, the water slowly fills the interstitial spaces in between all of the different, you know, particles. And I think what's hard about it is that if you look at our superficial geology maps, it's extraordinarily complex. The you know, where different soil, different, you know, bedrock, or different overburden materials are. Some flow water really well between them, some don't. There's clay layers which get in the way. Most of you people on the seacoast, you know all about those clay areas, those clay layers, because they cause lots of wetlands and they cause lots of challenges with construction, lots of water where you don't want it. Those are all complicating factors. And if you look at a geology map, it's just as complicated. So it's not a very straightforward proposition. In New Hampshire, we have extraordinary diversity in very short space. And the same is true with our climate. You know, this last weekend, we had the highest flows ever measured in the southern part of the state and the lowest flows ever measured in the northern part of the state on exactly the same day. So we have this crazy climate changes that also take place between north and south and east and west. And if you know well that you can be in Durham and it can be raining cats and dogs, and you go over to Lee and it's not raining. I mean, it's you know, it can be like that here. And so we just have a lot of complexity, and the groundwater complexity is especially challenging to try to understand, and it's really site specific.
Yeah, hey Ted, it's Gretchen from the city of Dover.
Hi Gretchen.
Thank you for pulling all of this together. I just wanted to share really quickly, just kind of following up on how fragile the whole water system is. Dover has 11 wells with 4 aquifers. And in this, with compounding with the drought, we have contamination in one, which pulled it down. We had high manganese, which is something that's newly being regulated, which was really pulling one of our wells down, and then just regular pump maintenance, which had one of our wells down. And the fourth aquifer is the Will End Pond, which is relatively new and seeing lower levels there. So with all of that and the drought, Dover was really kind of worried about how we were going to make it through, and we found some other opportunities. But I also wanted to say we did implement some mandatory water restrictions, which is all the outdoor water use, and went from 2.8 million gallons a day down to about 1.8 million gallons a day, essentially overnight. I mean, it was pretty incredible how quickly that happened. And then my big aha moment takeaway from Ted, what you just said is that, you know, a lot of the buzz on Facebook and things like that in Dover has been, you know, how can we sustain this continued development if we're having so many water issues? And in you saying, well, really the issues come from when you start adding lands or lawns. And we in Dover, that has nothing to do with me, but our planning crew have been doing sort of promoting cluster developments and allowing for conservation lands with smaller lawns, basically lawn areas. And I really appreciated that connection today.
Yeah, I think you could probably run that data yourself. And I think that would maybe an interesting piece of data analysis that may be helpful would be to understand what is the marginal, what is that marginal addition of water use for each person based on whether they're, you know, if they don't have a lawn or if they do have a lawn. So what does an apartment dweller do to your water use versus what does a, you know, half-acre lot do to your water use? And that's probably possible to parse out with, you know, in your system. I don't know, but it may be possible.
Barb, Dave?
No, Barb, go ahead.
I just have a question. Could you just address the lakes in our state and where they fit or if they fit into any of this? I think I just keep hearing in the west, and their lakes are going down and down and down and down. And so I'm wondering, is that going to happen here, or are we set, or don't you even monitor the lakes?
It's a great question. And the answer, I studied economics, and the answer to all questions in economics is it depends. And so, you know, that's, I think, appropriate here as well is, so we had a very hard time getting, let's just take Pawtuckaway Lake because it's nearby where you all are. And maybe Mendham's Pond as well. We had a very hard time filling up those lakes this year. And it was because we had such low winter snowpack conditions. We had such low flows in the spring. And then once that happened, it was very hard to fill up. So for a long time, Pawtuckaway was, you know, 8 inches below where normal management would be. Mendham's Pond was 10 inches below. We got a couple of rainstorms here and there that helped fill it up. And then, you know, what we see over the course of a summer is that Pawtuckaway Lake will drop around 18 inches or so in elevation over the course of the lake because the inflow just doesn't keep up with the evaporation forces. And so, and leakage and whatever else is going on. So you do see over the course of a summer, generally, we see dropping elevation in lakes normally. And that's, you know, to be expected, I think. We don't usually see dramatic drops because most of what's dropping is evaporation. And it takes a long time to evaporate, you know, a ton of water. So we generally are able to keep pretty good water quantity in our lakes. And especially since, you know, almost all of them are managed in some way. And as I noted, the cost of that is that we do tend to starve our river systems for water to maintain the elevation of our lakes. And that's just the nature of kind of part of how we manage water in the state. But we don't tend to see those kind of bathtub rings the way you see in other places. Although if you've ever been up to, Moore Reservoir or some of the places in the Connecticut where they are managing the water, it does go up and down a lot of feet, 20 feet. It's crazy. Yeah.
I have another question, but if anybody hasn't asked their question, I don't want to take the time. Okay, real quick, comment then a question. The comment's not related to the question, but I'll say it anyway. Having grown up in upstate New York and spent a lot of time in the Catskills, the reason New York City has such wonderful water isn't because there's some local water they're pulling out of any of those rivers or anything else down there. There's aqueducts in the Catskill Mountains that have enormous transmission pipes that come down from there and provide New York City with basically its water, and it's wonderful water, and that's where it comes from. Well, we have a lot of those big lakes and stuff like that in New Hampshire, and maybe it's, it's not too early to talk about making deals with people who I'm sure would be quite resistant perhaps with local, issues and all that, to talk about how you move water from one part of the state to another. So just a comment. I have a question about, real quick, temporary versus permanence, temporary versus relative permanence. And Mark, I think, I was triggered by your comment about what happens to the soil, So over time, a lot of things recover. We have some wet times, and eventually the aquifers will fill up, and we won't talk about stuff as much for, it might take some years or whatever. But my little piece of property with my big 1.5 acres with my house on it, and I don't water, these two droughts have wiped out the white pines on my property, which I used a lot for screening. They were all there. I didn't plant them. They're so shallow rooted, and my family thinks I'm strange, but I actually kept track of how many trees, between the last one 2-3 years ago and this most recent one, out of approximately 300 and something white pine trees that were anywhere from a couple of years old to, big giant ones, the small ones are wiped out almost. I might have about 50 left and have cut down, because they're dead, 300 trees that were as much as 8, 10, 12 years old, 15 years old. So my point is, there's this big gap where my little piece of the world, I say it's permanent damage, because unless I go buy trees or something, I can't bring back the 4, 5, 6, 8, 10, 12, 15-year-old trees. It's only the largest ones that seem to have hung in there. But I noticed with the second drought that we're in now, the trees that are dying off are getting bigger, the ones that are dying off. They're not as big as those monsters that have been around for, 100 years. But the ones that have actually been around for 20 years, 25 years, they're the next ones that are falling right now, dying. So can you talk permanency versus this temporary stuff, and eventually it'll just correct itself? Can you take a couple minutes on that somehow?
Well, I maybe ask Annie first if she has any thoughts on that, because I don't know if you've done any stories on sort of on this issue at all. But there's a big linkage between drought and disease and and stress on plants. And so I think, I don't know, Annie, if you've covered any of those kinds of connections.
Yeah, it's sort of a growing area of research. I mean, there is really a dearth of drought research in the Northeast generally relative to the rest of the country, is what folks at UNH have told me. But Heidi Esbjornson in the forestry department at UNH is doing like what is considered to be some of the sort of first of its kind work on how drought affects tree growth. They're doing a longitudinal study in your neck of the woods. I'll put the link here. Heidi is a great person to talk to about sort of ecological impacts from drought. I also did a story with a PhD student in her department who is looking at alternative tree syrups. So syrup from birch and beech instead of maples. And it really does come back to what you just said, Ted, about stress more than anything else. I think that's sort of the biggest lasting, I mean, the semantics are tricky. Like, I don't know if you could consider that to be sort of a permanent impact so much as just a new feature of these short-term impacts that has sort of a lasting effect. So, you know, I think my sense is that our climate change path is really going to lead mostly to short-term droughts, or even flash droughts is sometimes what they're called, which I don't know much about, you know, if those can sort of permanently deplete groundwater. I would say probably not necessarily, because it gets replenished by rain, but it does affect people's wells, and it does affect ecosystems in terms of die off, and then it just makes them more sensitive to everything else. And there are lots of other things that development and climate change are causing that are making those ecosystems sensitive. So pests, invasive species, you know, warming temperatures mean that new things are coming into the you know, into the ecosystem that weren't here before, and other things are beginning to not be here as much, like moose. We see this with the tick situation on a completely different topic. And these stronger storms too, you know, if a tree is sort of stressed by drought and then we get like a giant ice storm or something, that tree is going to be more likely to die. And then the more that certain kinds of trees are dying off, also from a lack of like routine fires, I mean, it all connects, the more that species that haven't been here before are moving in. And so we just see that kind of change happening as a result of these trends. But as for like water supply, I don't really know, Ted.
You can kill a well, you know, because again, the well is dependent on water in the interstitial spaces between the soil particles, or the aggregate particles. And you can collapse those interstitial spaces. You can do that. That is possible. And that's really, you know, so people who do, you know, there are many cases where people run their well dry and they just don't ever really work correctly again. And so you certainly can have permanent damage. And I agree. I think I'm one of my civic duties that I work on is I'm chair of the Concord's Street Tree Committee. And we just did an inventory. We redid an inventory that was done 20 years ago, and have found dramatic losses of street trees. And a lot of that has to do with, again, it's the stress. It's the salt stress, it's the heat stress, it's the conflicts with utilities, it's the drought stress that have occurred, it's the choice of species that are no longer surviving the way that they used to in our climate. So, you know, it really is dramatic what we're seeing. And I think, again, it's those compounded stress. It's all about resiliency. So if you're going to try to plant a tree in an urban environment, you're probably going to have to do some significant infrastructure around that tree in order to make it survive. Expensive infrastructure. And that becomes a big choices now for cities as to how do they do that.
Thank you.
So we're right at 11 o'clock here now, and I think we had advertised this as our end time. I don't know if our speakers have time for one more question. I will note there have been many great comments in the chat box, and Annie has shared several different stories through the chat box. We will pull that information and be able to share that out with everyone. Make sure if you're attending in person that you did leave your email address on the sign-in sheet. We're having a low battery moment here, so bear with us. We might be ending now, probably at 11.
My computer is very prompt.
And everyone who's participating virtually, by nature of your sign-in, we have your email address to be able to share that information with you. And so I will, you know, for fear that our battery is going to end the show here, I will say a huge thank you to Ted and Annie for joining us today, and being here to help lead a really invigorating and timely conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thanks for inviting me anytime. I'm happy to come and chat. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.